Is that?
Okay, great. I'd like to welcome everybody to Defining Democracy. My name is Nick Reitman, law student at John Marshall, member of Platypus. Sort of the genesis of this panel was digesting the recent experience with Occupy and its appeal to the labor movement, but also how the labor movement has sort of interacted with the Occupy idea, practice, and theory. Sort of the core concept I wanted to have the panelists address was the meaning of democracy, both within Occupy and within the labor movement. This is sort of a defining theme of labor's new reiteration of Occupy with the 99% spring, which has sort of become a very well-funded tool of the labor movement. And I think you're going to be seeing a little bit more of it come the next few months. Focusing the discussion, I had three frames that I wanted to have the panelists sort of discuss. It's going to be a little bit fast and loose. I told the panelists if they have a better way to frame or understand or present the way Occupy and labor have interacted, to feel free to run with it. That said, I'll toss out the sort of the three things that have been going around in my mind, three sort of axiomatic questions that have sort of framed the way I don't have any positions or any really understandings. That's sort of why we're here to talk about the panel. But these are three things that have been on the top of my mind, three questions that have kind of sparked my curiosity. The first would be framing the tension between leadership and procedural democracy in both the labor movement and Occupy. In particular, I wanted to get panelists' ideas on what sort of concrete political decisions would mean in the context of a crisis. I emailed the panelists a question about the 2008 bailouts because I thought that sort of put a historic point on what I was trying to get at. The 2008 bailouts were deeply unpopular. I don't think that's controversial. And many in the mainstream labor movement, members, rank and file, and obviously the mainstream labor movement leadership, sort of endorsed Obama's line that these were extraordinary interventions that, sort of investing, in a strategic and social way in the auto companies and in our manufacturing base was sort of antithetical to American understandings of property. And this sort of rationale was accepted in the mainstream labor movement. And, if you took a vote of hands like you would at Occupy, if you sort of elevated the procedural aspect of democracy within the labor movement at this point in time on this particular question, it would have been up for debate whether or not the labor movement itself would have pushed for something more radical. There wasn't a per se leftist position on what to do with the auto bailouts, but I feel like there was at least an umbrella left critique of how Obama handled it. So that was sort of the first framing I wanted to do. What would how would you discuss, sort of ideological conflict within Occupy, discussing notions of property, sort of challenging people, while also, dealing with the very strong emphasis on democracy, on procedural, on devotion to the idea of consensus almost. The second framing, it's related. All three sort of framings in my mind were related to this tension between leadership and democracy, understood procedurally as presented by Occupy. But the second framing I wanted to put out there was basically the trajectory of Occupy as sort of an umbrella political movement. Here we're talking about the meme of the 99%. It's both an ideological umbrella, where you try and fit everybody under this 99% understanding of themselves and what they do in political action and activity, and then also fit everyone's demands on the same butcher pad. If you've been to these Occupy events, it's a call and response kind of interaction. It leads to sort of a Howard Zinn People's Encyclopedia of everything wrong with the 1%. I was at this 99% spring training last weekend, and this is exactly what we did. This is an effort paid for by mainstream labor, and you call on a room full of 80 people. You write up everything that people call out as the agenda of the 1%, and that's what you're against, right? And then you do, what are the values of the 99%? Same kind of interaction. And for me, this is sort of a good example of what this umbrella activity sort of looks like. So I kind of wanted to have panelists discuss and digest what this activity meant. Is this a necessary first step, as Occupy sort of frames it, towards a more articulated political critique? Is this how we get people into the waters of talking about politics at all? Is just relating and equalizing everyone's personal experience? We have Prussians listed up here, everyone's equal. Here we're going to talk about it, and this is sort of the entry board into a more sophisticated political discussion. Is that necessary? Is it desirable? And also I wanted to push panelists to think about the presumptions behind this political understanding. What does this presume? What does this activity presume about how the unorganized become politically active? Because obviously this has a working theory, it's a praxis. What I guess first is like, how do we understand this praxis, and what would the, do you have a critique of it, or is this something that's necessary? And then the third and probably most practical point I wanted to sort of raise for this discussion was sort of assessing Occupy's recent turn strategically. Again, I don't think this framing is necessarily controversial, but I wanted to sort of pose the question of Occupy sort of as disruption versus Occupy as public forum and the implications for the labor movement in particular. Pretty much since the Oakland general strike, which was sort of heralded as a strategic turn for Occupy. Here we're going to create economic disruption as sort of a tool to, accomplish something. I mean, here I'm not trying to throw this upon Occupy as a whole. It's a very, it's almost impossible to sort of attribute some kind of meta political agenda to Occupy, but I feel like it's a very strong and very resonant political understanding. Particularly with the folks who are organizing the May 1st general strike call. What would economic disruption on one day mean, right? Like, is this a strategy for the labor movement? Do we begin to organize workers around strategically disrupting the economy? Do we try and send Occupy people to organize, building cleaners and have them all walk out on one day and shut down a downtown area in a major city? Ideas are passed around between labor radicals. Articles are passed around on Facebook and the internet about what they're doing in Europe. You can't really say that this is too much of an outlier, because this is pretty much what's happening in Greece already with the mainstream labor movement. Sort of political protests against austerity programs have sort of taken a turn towards maximizing economic disruption. There you even have very important infrastructure unions going out on strike. You have folks who would repair electrical lines going out on the line. That creates massive disruption. And then I wanted to sort of pose that question, what does that presuppose about how people would enter the movement? What does that presuppose about change? What does that presuppose about society, and why would we do that? Not saying as a sort of a positivist thing. What are these people thinking? What would we have to learn from it? But also I wanted to put that in a frame, side by side with Occupy as a different conception, because I feel there's another way to think about Occupy, which was the actual occupation of public space. This is sort of the Rachel Maddow version of Occupy, if you think about it. Occupy is a public forum where you have people literally starting discussions about whatever institution is wrong. And Wall Street's case, in the original case, it was, we're going to have the discussion about Wall Street and financial reform on Wall Street, right? This is sort of a different way to think about it, where the emphasis isn't on disruption. And of course, in the original Occupy Wall Street, you had both going on. The original call was to disrupt Wall Street, but it sort of turned into a more, First Amendment, we're going to have a park in front of Wall Street where you can go, and it's literally an unavoidable discussion you get sucked into about what's wrong with this country. So I kind of wanted to look at both of those practical points. How do both of these understand politics? What does this mean for the labor movement? Why has the labor movement in America seemed to pick the more Rachel Maddow version of Occupy as a permanent presence, as a public forum, as an exercise of First Amendment rights? Why do some labor radicals sort of look towards the European austerity disruption model, sort of the West Coast port blockade model? What does this sort of tension represent politically? And what are your thoughts on it? And where do we go from here as both Occupy and labor? All the panelists have an interest, prolific, writings in some cases about politics, labor, and we're all trying to understand Occupy here. So this is more about putting things on the table that haven't necessarily been widely discussed. I mean, the labor movement itself is pretty instrumental. You don't get too much reflection on it. So hopefully this will be, a good conversation about where we've been, where we're going, sort of just taking stock of what's been going on. I've already talked too long, so I'm going to kick it over to the panelists. Hopefully they remember maybe one sentence I said. I know I was going on for a little bit. But I guess first let me go down the line, introduce the panelists. We have David Moberg here from In These Times. We have John Peterson from International Marxist Tendency. And we also have Mark Schalise from Occupy Chicago's Labor Committee, graciously stepping in for James Manos from the Occupy Labor Committee, who unfortunately, terribly had a family emergency and couldn't be with us. So I guess let me turn it over to the panelists. We're going to try and do the format, 10-15 minutes to sort of address, what their understanding about occupying labor, what they would like to sort of have a discussion about, whether or not they feel the framings were adequate, or if they have a different way to go about it. We're all kind of thinking about the same things. So we'll do 10-15 for each. We'll probably come back and have a few responses among the panelists, and then we'll open it up to audience participation and questions. And that should round out the panel. So, with that said, I guess we'll wait just a few more seconds so everyone can get settled. And David.
Thank you. Thanks for setting things up. I'm going to try to address those questions that were posed for occupying the labor movement. But first, I thought I'd talk a little bit about democracy in a very general way, perhaps too general for some of you, but I think it raises some questions, because democracy seems like something that the Occupy movement, the labor movement, most Americans, few, maybe the Koch brothers don't believe in democracy, but most Americans would claim to believe in democracy. And yet, it's not quite as simple an idea as it seems at first glance. And obviously it means rule by the people, but there's a question in any circumstance of who are the people. In a union, obviously at first blush it would seem to be the members. But a union also tends to speak for non-members in a particular industry in many cases, and as a labor movement claims to speak for the working class as a whole in many cases. And so a question about democracy then can get sort of tricky in terms of who makes the decisions for the union. So you have people who are speaking as a small group on behalf of a much larger group. But there's always a question about boundaries in terms of democracy. You know, for example, in a union, I can't walk into some other union and say, well, you know, I support the working class, therefore I should be here to cast a vote. They say, well, are you a member? No, then get out. That's a boundary that's drawn. I mean, there are boundaries that we run into that are perhaps even more profound than that. For example, we're in the early stages of a presidential election where probably a great many Americans will not vote, but there are a great many people around the world who would really like to vote because whoever's elected president of the United States may have more impact on their lives than who they elect as president of their country. So there's always this question about boundaries. And one of the boundaries that we've seen expand over the years has been the boundary of expansion of democracy in terms of who has some voice. The Chartist movement was an important movement for bringing the working class into the suffrage in 19th century England. Obviously, the civil rights movement, women's movement in this country, and an ongoing movement both to constrain who can vote, as we see with a lot of Republican state legislatures over the past year or so, and to try to expand it. But there's also been a part of democracy is not simply these ideas about majority rule and making decisions. It's also a question of rights, of individual rights. And there's been an expansion in most of the world, less so in this country, of the idea of rights going beyond something as fundamental as suffrage or the vote to include substantive rights like right to health. Still fighting for that with the Supreme Court. Not sure whether that's something legitimate for a government to provide. And also, in many cases, right to housing or other substantive rights like that. So there's this question of who are the people, but also a question of what does it mean to rule. And again, there are all sorts of degrees in terms of what it means to rule. You know, in part, you know, you can think of the spectrum just in terms of recent political life in this country, people talking about representative democracy versus participatory democracy. And again, in most societies, there's also limitations on the right to rule. We have a Bill of Rights which supposedly constrains, you know, what even a majority can do in terms of ruling in a society as a whole. And oftentimes in organizations it is the same kind of minority rights. And then there's a question of who speaks for the people. And again, I touched that a bit, in that there are always various small groups. It can be somebody who considers themselves some kind of vanguard political group, or it could be a mass political party, or anything in between, who claim to speak for the majority, and claim to speak for at least large numbers of people in society. And there's always this question then about how any of these groups not only win support, but how they get legitimated. And you know, how do we know whether to take them at all seriously? You know, so if somebody from a small political group says, you know, that I'm speaking on behalf of a revolution, on behalf of the majority, and this is an expression of majority democracy, the question anybody's going to ask was, well, who supports that point of view? And it may very well be that it is in the majority's interest, but if the majority does not support that particular point of view, how democratic would that claim be? And there are other ways we have to keep in mind that people express kind of democratic decisions. One is sort of the thing we're most familiar with, is some kind of direct voice, either a voice through a vote or a more direct voice in some circumstances where people can actually vote on a particular policy. But there's another important way in which people express their views of the world, and that, identified by a famous political philosopher, Albert Hirschman, is exit. People can simply drop out as a way of expressing their point of view. They can refuse to participate. And this is probably one of the main ways in which many Americans have chosen to participate. But of course, it obviously limits what they can actually do. And in mainstream political science, this kind of exiting or sort of passive assent to what goes on is taken for actual support. And so if people don't vote against some existing regime, then they're taken to support it. So there also, in terms of democracy, there's this big question about the relationship between formal democracy, which is what most people talk about, in terms of the right to vote or the right to free speech or something like that, versus some kind of substantive democracy. And many people on the left are sort of dismissive of the formal democracy, and yet it can have important effects on what goes on in our society. So there's constantly a call on the left in this country, which most of us may feel some sympathy for, a Labor Party. And yet if you look at the way electoral system is set up in this country, it's very antagonistic to the success of anything like a Labor Party. And so the kind of formal mechanisms of democracy that get established end up having an important impact on substantive kind of democracy that we're capable of having. Let me just mention before I finally turn to these original framing questions, one other point, and that is there's always a tension between organization and social movements. Usually the two coincide, but they have a different kind of character. And one of the things that's partly a tension that shows up between labor unions and a movement like Occupy. The strength of an organization is typically that it has a formal structure, it has a financial support, it has a way of continuing beyond a particular set of leaders or a particular moment. I mean, there are many unions in this country that have been around for over 100 years. They may not be very big still, but some of them are actually fairly good sized. Like a carpenters union that's been around for a long period of time. How many movements have we seen come and go in the course of 100 years? So there's something to be said for that. Now, the other thing that's obviously a disadvantage is that there is, what actually got described once as the iron law of oligarchy in looking at European social democratic movements and trade unions. And that is a tendency for them to become top-heavy and bureaucratic, and losing a lot of the character of a social movement. And we have some unions that are heavily oligarchic, bureaucratic, some that are more movement-oriented. One of the things that's important in terms of the character of these organizations is actually the style of leadership, which was one of the questions got framed. In most organizations, the degree of democracy has a great deal to do not only with the self-organization of the membership, but also the kind of support for democracy that exists from the leadership. And so some leaders see democracy as something that strengthens their movement, strengthens their organization, and others feel threatened by it, threatened that they will lose their power. And we have examples of both of that kind of leadership in the existing unions in this country. So let me just turn to some of these final questions, and I'll wrap up my remarks. Regarding the call for democracy in the labor movement, I think that from my point of view, there's no question but there's more need for democracy, not just at the formal level of, say, direct election of presidents of unions, which now takes place in only a handful of unions, but also more of a participatory democracy. And this means not only making more decisions directly by members, but having members more engaged in doing the work of the union. And a number of unions have moved in this direction in terms of trying to get members trained to work within their own workplaces to resolve their own grievances rather than calling a business agent or international representative, somebody to do that. So they become engaged in actually being the union, or when they're trying to organize, that they actually try to get people who they're organizing to act as if they already had a union as part of that. And this kind of democracy then becomes a democracy not just of kind of decision-making, but also of action. But I think that there's oftentimes a kind of tendency on much of the left, somewhat justified, that these existing bureaucratic leaders are what's holding back the labor movement, or what's holding back the working class. I'll put it in a caricature, if it weren't for the pie cards, the workers would be storming the gates for a revolution. Obviously a caricature of but at times I run into people on the left who are close to that caricature. And I think it's pretty safe to say that that's not the case in the United States. And much as we might look to a place like Greece or France or someplace else where general strikes or national strikes or political strikes are part of the culture, we're a long way from that. And we're also a long way from it, not just in terms of the kind of numbers that would make it possible with the labor movement as small as it is, but we're a long way from it in terms of kind of the political sympathies and the kind of class perspectives that people have on our society. So in a case like France, the formal membership of the labor movement is perhaps about the same as in the United States, somewhere below 12%. But if a union calls a strike, it's widely respected. It has, even when it inconveniences the public, it has a lot of public support. And it's part of a kind of a political culture that's been built up over a long period of time, and it's something we have to come to grips with here. And this, apropos, obviously, the auto bailout. I mean, the automobile, the UAW was in a very difficult position. I mean, I think that the deal they got was not a particularly good deal compared to bankruptcy of GM and Chrysler. I think it was a good deal. So it was a relatively good bankruptcy settlement, and that's about as far as it went. Could they have pushed for more? Well, just the kind of framing we got on that suggests it would have been hard to get a lot more. There just wasn't the public support. At the early part of the Great Recession, polling indicated a sharp drop-off even in support for labor unions and seeing them as having too much power, believe it or not. And one of the reason some people thought that was taking place was because it was at that same time that there was all this discussion about auto workers making $75 or $85 an hour, which of course they didn't. But it was a situation where politically, whatever the union leadership might have wanted, there were great constraints about how far they were going to be able to push things. Let me end up with these other two things. I've unfortunately been all too distant observer of the Occupy movement, so I'm in a bad position to sort of, even make suggestions about what people who've been more active in it should be doing. But it seems to me that overwhelmingly the great accomplishment is this setting firmly in the public mind this paradigm of the 1% versus the 99%. And I think the real challenge for the movement is to retain that, to keep that. And it's a very difficult thing, because if there's anything that the 1% is expert at over many, many decades, if not centuries, is divide and conquer. I mean, dividing, the working class, over race, over all sorts of other issues has, gone on for forever. Trying to keep some identification between all the different elements of the 99% versus the 1% is a particularly great challenge. But I think that it is one that is extremely important. And I think that in many ways there's the opportunity to link that broader framework with particular campaigns. Like Stephen Lerner, who's still with the SEIU, was arguing that focusing on campaigns about home ownership, about the right to decent work, and about student debt loads in particular, would be a way of giving some kind of concrete manifestation to that 1% versus the 99%. But one of the things to keep in mind, I think, in both defining campaigns and in working together, and in terms of tactics, is not to lose that paradigmatic division of society between the extremely rich and powerful and the rest of us. All right, I added some few things other to say, but let me just end up on this question of tactics. The disruption obviously can be extremely effective. It's effective in particular, like Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven famously wrote, and Glenn Beck got all exercised about. If you have somebody like welfare mothers in the 60s who nobody cared about, if they suddenly disrupted some event, they forced people to pay attention to them. Well, if you're claiming to speak on behalf of the 99%, then you're not a kind of ignored minority. You're claiming to be speaking for a majority. And so that frames the issue of disruption in a slightly different way. And I think that it requires that kind of disruptive tactics to mainly hit at the elite itself rather than endanger losing the general public. It needs to be focused and prepared so that people understand why there's this disruption. One of the problems with the disruption is losing control of your own message. And this is one thing that happens so much in the anti-war movement in the 60s and 70s, is that the demonstrations that got the most coverage were the ones that had involved some kind of violence, and yet then the demonstration lost control of its message about what it was actually trying to say politically. And I think that applies not just to losing the general public, but to losing important allies as well. And labor is part of that, and that was one of the risks that was run with that open action by Occupy, focused on the ports, where the Longshore Union, which is quite progressive politically, was not in support of it. And it caused difficulties for the union. But fortunately, they broad-minded enough politically that it was not disastrous consequences. So let me stop with that final thought for now.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let me, if I could just take a privilege of being moderator today. If I could ask you both to keep it within like 15, we're just running up against the time. I'm sorry I took up a little bit too much with my opening remarks. But yeah, great, if you could take it from here.
All right. Well, thanks to Platypus for putting this on. Just a few things to keep in mind, I think, and then I'll go into some of my thoughts on this question. First of all, that we can't predict the future solely on the recent past and what's happening today. I think it's safe to say that the next 10 years are going to be very different from the last 10 years. And also that the demands that we put forward have to flow from the objective necessity of the situation, not be based only on what is acceptable or what is the norm or what is, what has majority support at any given time. I think given the lack of political clarity in this country, that there are very wild swings of opinion from right to left and back again. I think we've seen some dramatic shifts in the recent period. So I think the framework of this discussion has to be expanded a little bit. In my opinion, Occupy, the emergence of Occupy is a result of the failure of Obama and the Democrats to actually bring about any real change in the face of the crisis of capitalism. Even more importantly, in my opinion, it's a result of the failure of the labor leadership to provide any sort of social or political vehicle for workers and young people and for society generally to express these frustrations. Since nature abhors a vacuum, something had to fill that space, and I think that this sort of explosion of the Occupy movement, again influenced in part by events taking place all around the world, attempted to fill out that space. And I think the failure, ultimately, of these labor leaders from providing any sort of way forward is the fact that they do accept that capitalism is the only way to go. They accept the politics of class collaboration, they reject socialism, they think that they have to limit their perspectives to the limits of this system, both economically and politically. And that, of course, leads to collaboration at the workplace, which means, concessions and so on, and also support for the bosses' political parties at the polls. And that means accepting austerity, it means, falling into lesser evil politics, and so on. Now, in any struggle, I think you need democracy, you need accountability, and you need rank and file participation, both in the labor movement and in Occupy. But I think that, in my experience working with the Occupy movement, that the consensus model and horizontalism and everything led to a lot of just paralysis and people just falling completely out of activity. And then frankly, you have, someone spoke yesterday about everyone has a voice and a vote and a say, and I would add and a veto as well if you have that kind of a model. I mean, it just leads to complete, paralysis. At the same time, I think therefore you need that participation and democracy and accountability, but you also need centralism. You need to take decisions somehow, and you have to implement those decisions in some way. But of course, we don't want the tyranny from above, an unaccountable bureaucracy that's ordering you to do things. So I think both movements, the labor movement and the Occupy movement, kind of bend the stick in either direction a bit too far. And I think there's a lot of suspicion between the two because Occupy thinks that labor is too top down, and labor thinks that Occupy is too bottom up and too naive, about what they're going to do and so on. I think both movements overwhelmingly have a reformist view as far as capitalism is concerned right now. But little by little, people are learning from their experience. I think Occupy definitely gave the labor movement a much-needed breath of fresh air, put a lot of wind to the sails of Occupy, and vice versa. I mean, I think a lot of people don't talk about or don't know just how much labor supported Occupy Wall Street in New York, and giving office space and printing the newspaper that they produced and so on. But I'd say that in the long run, Occupy needs labor a lot more than labor needs Occupy as such. I mean, the labor movement, the working class, are a force in society due to their position in that society, due to their relation to the means of production, and therefore they can actually change society. Whereas Occupy, I think, like I said, filling that vacuum, can serve as a catalyst, can play an auxiliary role, if you will, but at the same time, I don't think it can play an independent role in society. As important it is, I think, as a barometer for the discontent that's been building up in society. And so obviously, despite the potential power of the working class, and I disagree that the unions are somehow impotent or that they just don't have the muscle to do much, and I'll touch on that in a second. Despite that power, though, the leadership that is in place right now and its policies of collaboration mean that labor can't effectively mobilize and fight back against the attacks against the austerity. And therefore, I mean, I believe part of a organization that comes from the Trotskyist tradition. And one of the main points that Trotsky raised later in his life is that the crisis of the working class is the crisis of its leadership, the lack of an adequate leadership that can move us beyond the parameters of this system. I think a lot of the tension between labor and Occupy is also a result directly of electoral politics. Part of the reason, like I said, that Occupy emerged is because they were frustrated with the Tea Party and Obama and so on. At the same time, the labor has come in, organized labor, and wants to, I think, quite clearly co-opt Occupy movement, use their message, use their energy, try and get them, even if they don't say it, to try and get them to vote for the Democrats, because there just is no alternative out there. So I think that makes them suspicious of each other. I think, like I said, the labor movement thinks thinks that Occupy is naive and not pragmatic enough, and why didn't you just go with the flow with less revalism, and there's no other alternative. So there's a logjam there, and I think, again, the question of a labor party, I think it is an important question. I think that if the unions were to break, and I know at this point in time it might seem very far-fetched and very difficult perspective to accept, but if the unions break with the Democrats and Republicans and put forward at the very least independent labor candidates, building towards an actual labor party, I think it would start breaking up a lot of that contradiction between those two forces. And I think it would unleash all kinds of potential energy in society that right now is just kind of locked up in the two-party logjam, or the sort of apolitical logjam. But a labor party wouldn't be a solution in and of itself, obviously. I mean, a labor party that accepts the framework of capitalism isn't going to be able to address the problem of jobs or of healthcare or of education. And that's why I would argue that a labor party has to have a socialist program. And I think that with the formation of a labor party, it would give socialists a mass vehicle then to connect with people about the need for socialist policies. So like I said, I think that the demands that we raise really need to flow from the objective needs of society. We can't just limit ourselves to what's acceptable now, because like I said, there can be big dramatic changes, and there have been just in the last 10 years big dramatic changes. So I think the idea of the 1% versus the 99%, I think all too often it's more like, how can we make the 1% more accountable, or how can we make the 1% more nice, or more whatever. I mean, I think we need to pose the question of, why does there have to be a 1%? Or why does it or do we expand it to 10%? Is that better, or what? I mean, we need a different kind of a society altogether, and that's why the question of building, a force in society that can actually go beyond the limits of capitalism is important. On the auto bailout, I mean, I think that, again, with this idea that we have to raise demands that flow from the needs, I mean, by limiting ourselves to the framework that Obama put forward, you inevitably fall into a sort of lesser evalism in that field. And I think that the only appropriate demand at the time was for nationalization of the auto industry under workers' control. That wasn't going to happen in 2008, I understand, but still, that really is the demand that could have started to address these problems. Instead of, a lot of people, they were able to use it as a wedge and say, oh, look, these overpaid, greedy workers that are, they want to be treated special, especially compared to the rest of you. And a lot of people, ordinary people, I think they saw it as sort of concessions to the bosses. And I think a lot of workers, handouts to the big companies, and I think a lot of workers, because with those handouts came a whole series of cuts and austerity within the plants, they thought, well, this is not, we've got contracts, we've got, we don't want to accept this kind of stuff. So, I think the question needs to be broadened, the question of strikes, of going beyond the limitations of things like Taft-Hartley and other anti-labor laws in this country that restrict labor, and if you play by the rules, the people who wrote the rules are always going to win. I mean, that's just the way it works. So we have to go beyond that. And I know a lot of people think that, well, this isn't the 30s, this isn't the 70s or whatever. But in the 20s, they said the same thing about the period they had just come through and so on. So I do think that similar conditions will lead to similar results, not exact, precise results. Every country has its own traditions, has its own rhythms, has its own organizations, and so on. But I don't think we can rule out that in the coming period there will be mass waves of strikes, that there will be mass unionization drives in the South, for example. So, I mean, I think that there is going to be a lot of change in the next period, that we can't just limit ourselves to the recent period. A lot of the questions that were raised, I've got a few notes here, but yeah, the question of like the blockade of the Oakland port. I mean, you know, blocking the workers from going to work is very different from, you know, the workers voting, as they have done at times on you know, in the ILWU, to actually shut down the ports and actually not go to work and so on. And of course, I think, you know, some of the limited experience that there has been of that on the West Coast in the last 20 years or so was the fact that it wasn't more generalized was because of the general period that this was taking place in. But I think that, you know, these kinds of examples of not just sort of, you know, disrupting for a day or but actually posing the question of the workers taking political power, the workers actually taking over these factories and running them in the interests of society generally is what has to be posed, as opposed to, you know, just sort of small disruptions. I think we really have to put the big picture out there, because, you know, the polls show that there's, you know, very rapid changes in opinion, and I think that if we're not there explaining, you know, what really needs to happen at a given time, then nobody's going to hear this message at those moments when people are ripe and open. You know, they're you know, open to hearing this kind of a message. And you know, an idea whose time has come can take off very quickly under certain circumstances. So I think if we're not prepared to very honestly and clearly put these things out there, and if we limit ourselves to the two parties, we limit ourselves to capitalism, then we're going to do a disservice to the working class and then everyone else who, you know, I'm sure all of us here you know, believe we're fighting for. So I guess I'll leave my comments to that.
Hi, I'm from the Occupy Chicago Labor Committee. I was with Occupy Chicago while I was kind of like, I was with them kind of from the first day. I was on the corner leafleting for a union when they marched up, but I didn't really get involved. I got involved gradually, bit by bit, over time. And I would have to say that people misunderstand the Occupy movement. Everybody thinks that Occupy is supposed to be what they're used to. They think it's supposed to be, you know, people from LVJO, Little Village Environmental Justice, say, well, you should be like Little Village Environmental Justice. You know, or as people from the Rainforest Action Network say, you should be like the Rainforest Action Network. Or people from the, you know, from RCP say you should be the RCP, you know, but we are none of these things. You know, we're not even explicitly against capitalism. What we are is we are a democracy movement. Is what we like you know, occupations generally are. People like Tahrir Square, like Tunisia, like Tiananmen Square, like Red Square. You know, we are a democracy movement. We are small d Democrats, first and foremost. We don't believe that it is our job to get everybody else to accept our ideology. We don't think that we should decide for everybody else what's good for them. We believe in democracy. We are enabling people to speak for themselves, and that's really what gave us the power, momentum, and the impact that we had, because we allowed people to speak for themselves. We allowed people to say what they were always wanting to say, or you know, what we said was what people already wanted to say. We didn't tell them what they needed to say. We didn't tell them what they needed to think. And so, so our issues initially were fairly mainstream. You know, reinstating Glass-Steagall, things like that. You know, they were not, but they were something we could all agree upon. Now, a lot of us in the movement are far left, but you know, that's us. That's not, we can't, you know, we can't speak for everybody else. Essentially what it is what we believe that what's needed is not a redistribution of wealth, but a redistribution of power. And if you redistribute power, a redistribution of wealth will inevitably follow. And we essentially, see, we would rather than be purists, ideological purists, you know, we would say, okay, we will accept revolution or nothing and lose. We would rather win on something. You know what I mean? We would rather take something that we can all agree on and get some results, you know, and win on this, you know. For example, if we were to take money out of politics, if we were able to, like, you know, undo Citizens United, if we were to take, you know, undo all the influence of money in politics, it would be possible to adopt the people's agenda. It would lead to a lot of different things, you know. It would, so you know, so it's like, we would rather, I think, see results than be ideologically pure. And so, you know, we're kind of Olinskiist, a lot of us. You know, we got, in fact, a lot of the language is Olinskiist. Olinsky believed that everything had to be 100% to zero. You know, if you had to, that's how you had to frame it to get the people with you. You know, so we modified it a little. We made it 99% to 1. You know, so, but you know, but essentially it's about power, and it's about power for. And it's about power for everybody, the common people, everybody having equal power, and we think that would lead to a just society. And we think it's kind of like undemocratic to decide for everybody else what's good for them. So, you know, essentially, I would say that that's what it is. Now, our disdain for representative democracy, is part of our how we approach labor as well as government. It's similar to, it's very similar to how Obama would sell us out, would sell his people out, the people who voted for him out, similar to how a union official would sell his, his rank and file out, similar things like that. We are not, we have a disdain for representative democracy. We believe that that's not at all democratic in this result. We are in fact wary of being co-opted by the unions. A lot of people do, in fact, they see us as an opportunity. They see us as an opportunity to further their own purposes, their own organizations, their own, and that sort of thing. And we don't necessarily, want to go along with that. So we adopted. For example, we adopted a "Who We Are" statement. That was a statement of independence, of our independent purpose, and it was patterned after the Occupy Wall Street "Who We Are" statement, and that was in direct response to people like the SEIU using our language, of 99% and such a thing, implying that Occupy Wall Street was, or Occupy movements were endorsing Obama. So we objected to that. And we decided that we'll collaborate with them when it suits our purposes, but we are something something separate, something independent of that. So we are in fact wary of being co-opted by the unions and everybody else. So and as far as like an umbrella organization, I would say that we're more like a glue. We're more like a glue that unifies people. We have like our labor committee. We have members of different unions, the more radical members coming together, and perhaps some more radical organizations. Some of those who are not traditionally organized. We have the taxi drivers, we have the day laborers, people like that, and so we have people who are, the more radical members. Some of them are officials in the unions and that sort of thing, But as far as an umbrella is concerned, some of the claims to be on the same page with us are not exactly truthful. I'm sorry I didn't have time to prepare anything really, but do you have a copy of the questions?
Marked up. You might have.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you'd like.
If I could look at them a second.
Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, just heads up in terms of facilitation. We had to cancel, I think I might have mentioned this at the beginning. We had cancellation, so thankfully Mark has agreed to step up.
Okay.
I just got the questions.
Okay, great.
So,
Right. I just actually saw them this morning. But,
yeah, the top three, I mean, that's kind of the
Right.
view.
Gotcha. Okay.
May I please say something? I was actually one of the first organizers with the Occupy Chicago Labor Committee. I had to fight to have the Labor Committee. There are a few things that I wanted to say. I hear a lot of you guys.
Can I finish first?
Yeah, go ahead, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I guess just to take the privilege of moderation again. I'll open it up for, questions, responses, reflections. Definitely would love to hear your point, your perspective, right after Mark's done.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No problem. just a little bit of a technical difficulty here.
Yeah, see, now Occupy is public forum, I mean, it's, you know, it's hard to say right now what Occupy is gonna be, what it is, you know, what it's going to become. Occupy is public forum, what it was in the past, and what it was until now. And that might have been, it had a valid niche there, it had a valid purpose there, it had a valid role there in society. Now, Occupy's disruption might be a different, might be somewhat of a, you know, I mean, there are some people who think that we should be a paramilitary group. There are some people who think that we should not, right, I mean, there are some people who really think that we should be, you know, we should be learning how to parachute out of helicopters and things like that, you know, and I don't think that's what we should be at all. I think we're just a people's democracy movement, really, but, you know, and I don't know that we should be a group of saboteurs, you know, and that kind of thing, there's, you know, I would say now in Chicago, we balked at the language of the general strike for May 1st, and part of it might have been because, well, we weren't really prepared for it. Now the language of the general strike, now Occupy, now the ILWU is kind of like unique in a sense that see when labor became like you know, under the labor board, National Labor Relations Board, and became you know, under contract, it had to it wasn't, you know, sympathy strikes became illegal, you know, and everything had to be done. I mean, if it wasn't in your contract, I mean, you were out of luck, you know, you couldn't go on strike. Now, the ILWU is a little bit unique in that there's a provision in their contract that allows them to go to do sympathy strikes, you know, which is not true elsewhere. Now, in Chicago, we balked at the language of the May Day Committee balked at the language of the general strike. They just weren't prepared for that, and there's a lot of things that I mean, if you're not prepared for them, you know, for example, the auto bailout. Now, sure, you know, conceivably, you know, we could have, you know, Obama could have nationalized the auto industry and that sort of thing, but are the prerequisite conditions in place for that? I mean, it's not like in Franklin Roosevelt's time, you know, or not, you know, or even, you know, I mean, it's just something that's easy to say, it seems to me, and but I mean, like, there's a lot of work in preparation for that we should have to do, you know, really. You know, that isn't done, you know, it's all fine to call for that, but, you know, we have to make that happen, so, you know, it seems to me, so.
Well, Mark, if you don't mind, now I guess we could take, I was thinking maybe 2 comments, questions from the audience, and then we'll have the panelists sort of integrate their responses with the feedback from the audience. You know, unfortunately, we only have about 25 minutes left. So if you'd like to begin in the back, and then we'll have one more, and hopefully we'll have the second round.
First, I'd like to apologize to everybody, especially Mark, for cutting him off. I was chomping at the bit a little bit. I was actually involved with Occupy since it was, well, 2 days before they hit the streets, but I knew about Occupy Wall Street from the first day it was announced. I'm not an activist, I'm just a regular person. A lot of people, I'm going to talk really fast. A lot of people mention tension within the labor movements and the Occupy. This did initially happen the first 2 weeks, but we fought against it. The largest marches that happened across the country were because labor and Occupy worked together. 50,000 people in Times Square, that was unions. Thousands of people in Chicago, that was unions. A lot of union members, because they were kind of nervous, they didn't want to feel like they were co-opting the movement, flew by night. So you didn't know you could be standing right next to a teacher or a machinist. You didn't know. They didn't want to appear like they were co-opting the movement. So there were a lot of energy within the workers. With regard to workers being allowed to organize without unions, this is a good idea. And actually, the NLRA was supposed to be changed January 31st to allow workers to collectively bargain within the workplace without a union. This has been pushed back. This law has not come to pass. Unfortunately, I haven't been following what's going on with that, but perhaps if people actually got together to fight against that, maybe this law would be enacted by the and involved in the NLRA. I think that the 1% and the 99% has entered the national lexicon, but I think one of the major problems is the rank and file has not been energized. Okay, In our meetings, we had meetings once a week for months. The organizers came. Very few rank and file came. So the problem was the rank and file isn't energized because it's hard to be energized when you're working 50 hours a week trying to pay for your take care of your family. In Madison, Wisconsin, labor did organize, and now they're recalling Governor Walker. Within the labor movement, we had ASME, SEIU, the Chicago Federation of Labor, the Chicago Teachers Union, the Amalgamated Teachers, the Amalgamated Transit Workers, Sprinkler Fitters, Machinists, Carpenters, United Steelworkers, Workers United, and letter carriers, which, like Mark said, were not allowed to strike when their contract was being up. So that's just a few things I wanted to say. I don't think there's as much tension between the labor movement and the Occupy as everybody wants to say.
Yeah, I'm Josh from the International Bolshevik Tendency. I just want to pick up on the point that Mark made, or the second to last point about the ILW having this provision of their contract that allows them to engage in civil strikes. They don't have that. Under Taft-Hartley, that's illegal in this country to have sympathy strikes. But the Dockers Union has done it anyway. They engaged in illegal strike activity, and that's important, I think. An important lesson, an important part of their tradition, which goes back to the 30s with Harry Bridges and the strike that in fact launched the union in the first place was illegal, led by an illegal immigrant. A good tradition, actually. And it's so just to correct that point, but to make a broader point that I think that, of course, it's important to establish those links between any sort of movement from below, like Occupy, that has emerged, and labor. But the question is not even so much one of linkages or even democracy, but political programming. And I actually agree with a lot of what John said, even though, of course, our groups differ on a lot of other things. But I think, abstractly at least, he made some very good points. And so I think it's important to fight for a perspective of building communist opposition within organized labor that can reach out to groups like Occupy and so on to establish real links on the basis of a class struggle program. And so again, it's a question of program, not, I mean, democracy is important. No one's going to say that it's not important, obviously, but program is really the key issue, I believe.
But see, then does an intellectual elite decide the program? See, I mean, see, Occupy is politically diverse. There are people of very different tendencies, and so it's not. I don't see. Is that the role that Occupy has to play? Is it the it's not really an anti-capitalist movement. It's really just a democracy movement. It's just something for, and it's something that, I mean, we accept anti-capitalist movements within us, kind of like as the umbrella or the glue. But is that Occupy's role is to be like I mean, that would narrow us some, and we would focus us some, and that would narrow us some, and we would lose a lot of people if we were to do that now. I think it's like the political education kind of comes while you're doing it. It seems to me that eventually people we don't want people who are not already radicals to not join, to think that they're not welcome. We want everybody to join, and then they can become radicalized after a while. You know what I'm saying? After they see the futility of working within the system, they become radicalized. But it's like because there's kind of it results in an exclusivity and it results in an isolation. When you're too purist in your ideology, it seems to me. That's all.
So I guess let me intervene. I would like to sort of put a little bit finer point on this discussion of program versus political experience, because I think this is sort of what I tried to highlight in the beginning remarks I made. What I'd like to get John, David, your thoughts on, is it the program that's going to drive the future collaboration between Occupy and labor? Is it the experience of what Occupy actually is, the practice of Occupy that's sort of going to drive it? Is it the practice of small d democracy? The substance, is it, David, using your lexicon, is it going to be the demands for substantive democracy like healthcare, housing, et cetera, that's going to drive it? 2 or 3 minute responses. I'll try and get another round of audience questions in there too. because it's 2:11 and we're supposed to be wrapping up after 20 minutes. So if either of you two want to bite on that, feel free.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, just if I could just have a few general points that have been raised as well now, as well as that. I mean, when you talk about it being a democracy movement, I mean, whose democracy and in whose interest? I mean, that's the question. I think part of it, you mentioned Tahrir Square. I think Tahrir Square is actually an important example of the limitations of this tactic. The movement, the occupation of Tahrir Square was about to be snuffed out. It was on the, I mean, I thought it was over, or on the verge of being over. And at that point, the working class came in. They started threatening to shut down the Suez Canal. The textile workers were going to go on strike and everything. And that's what really turned the tide. But at the same time, the regime in Egypt remains, even though Mubarak is gone. So that's why, you know, just occupying space isn't going to be enough. Obviously, it was a big inspiration, got the ball rolling. But ultimately, if you don't, you know, have real general strikes and shut down production, and you don't actually, you know, work towards political power, you're going to end up with a situation like it is now in Egypt. The question of, you know, you said it's about power, and then we can deal with the wealth. Well, I would agree. I mean, we need, but power means political power. You have to have political power before you can start, you know, controlling some of the economic levers that are going to lead to more equitable distribution of wealth. I think one of the big questions about a planned economy, people are like, well, you know, you want to nationalize this and that and have a planned economy, and it all sounds good in the abstract, but the bottom line is, you know, you can't plan something rationally if you don't control it. And you can't control something if you don't own it. I mean, you can pass as many laws or have as many protests as you want against, you know, the abuses of Wall Street and this or that, but, you know, until you actually control and own these levers of the economy, they're out of your control, and they'll find all kinds of ways to keep on doing what they want to do. If there's time, I'd like to address the question of Alinsky in a moment, but there isn't a whole lot of time for that. On the question of program, I mean, I think it's not Occupy or labor, or just, you know, one or the other. I think that Occupy, as I said, is sort of an expression of this deep undercurrent of discontent in this country. It's sort of, you know, merged together, you know, partially become a part of and partially still independent of the labor movement and vice versa. But I think in the period that we're entering, a period of austerity, a period of revolutions around the world and of crisis and of continued economic crisis, people, I think, they're hoping against hope that 2008, that, you know, that crisis was it, that things have gotten better now. You know, sure, there's still a giant jobs gap and blah, 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 but it's going to get better now. But I mean, the crisis is actually far from over. This is a whole epoch of crisis that we're going to be in, and people are going to get hammered, again, very brutally by the system. And I think that Occupy represents really just one of those initial currents that are coming together, that ultimately these movements are going to, you know, merge in some form. There's going to be, you know, economic components, there's going to be political components, and so you can't really, you know, separate the two out and say, is it one or the other or both, or which should I support or what? Because I think out of this general, you know, turbulence that we're going to see in the next period, you'll see mass unionization drives, you'll see mass protests, you'll see eventually general strikes. And just one final comment about the general strike is that, you know, Americans seem to think there's some sort of general strikes is like some mysterious, shadowy thing. You know, I talked to some of the labor leaders in Madison who announced that they would endorse a general strike if it came about, as if, you know, someday they'd wake up and there'd be a general strike. I mean, in Europe, even the sort of you know, even if you think they're just to let off steam or whatever, you know, these things are planned weeks in advance, months in advance. You know, they vote on this thing. There's maneuvering. Do we do it? Do we don't? Do we, you know, which unions are going to support? Who's going to go on? I mean, this is you know, I mean, it's an actual concrete thing that you prepare for. It just doesn't just happen. And even a general strike isn't a panacea. It doesn't solve anything. I mean, there's been how many general strikes in Greece in the last couple of years? 12. I mean, it's insane. There's more coming all over Europe. I mean, ultimately, you're going to need to use that experience to build up people's consciousness to understand the need for an indefinite general strike, both political and economic, and not just sort of, you know, let off steam for a day.
Can I speak to that?
Well, actually,
let's get some more.
yeah, if we could have,
comments.
you know, another round of questions, and then we'll have, you know, probably time for concluding remarks. Sorry, unfortunately, it took a little too much time earlier.
I'd like to ask a question relating to the understanding of capital applied by the way some of the comments in the panel. It seems that some of the comments are sort of redefining capital, or making like, we get rid of 1%, then suddenly capitalism becomes okay, or 1% is what generates capitalism, it's what creates institutions to support capital. And I would argue that really capitalism for the United States was sort of built by the labor movement in very particular ways. The institutions that form like the core of the capitalist state are, in many cases, actively reconstructed by the working class. And I just like to hear people's comments on that and how that presents a challenge of sort of ideologies of the workers as naturally revolutionary.
And one more from the audience.
I have a question. Marx argues when he talks about the hierarchy of labor in the United States and in Europe that the workers in the first world only become revolutionary when they act and think internationally. And I think that's part of the problem with this 99% versus 1%, is if we're only fighting for the 99% in this country, we run the danger of establishing a new state capitalist, imperialist nation that, like, can treat us very well, give us very good economic world, while still exploiting the hell out of the rest of the world. And that the danger I see is that Occupy and the labor movement right now is being manipulated in some ways and has a danger of falling into making these state capitalist demands, such as nationalization, that could end up actually furthering a neoliberal agenda in the global scheme of things. And how do we fight for the 99% who don't live in the first world, and how do we represent their interests globally?
Okay, so I guess if you could
Could we
try
get
and,
a couple more?
well, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have too much time left. We have about 10
And we'll
minutes.
just keep our comments even shorter though. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. If there's any more questions, I guess we could take one more.
It seems to me like you don't see the labor as part of the 99%. Is this true?
Yeah, if we could keep it to like 3 minutes, that'll probably round out the discussion.
All right, I'll try to keep it a bit short. I don't think there's particularly a choice between learning through action and learning through reading socialist newspapers or going to Occupy meetings or any other kind of traditional, non-traditional way of teaching and learning kind of situations. I think both are important, and one of the things that I think that Occupy can do as a democracy movement, which I think is a good way of them thinking of themselves, is to expand those arenas where people have a chance to carry on those discussions. So they don't have to come down to LaSalle Street or Wall Street, but rather you go to Arlington Heights or Oak Lawn, to church basements, to union halls, to wherever anybody will have you, and have these discussions. And think also of ways in which people can be involved at a very low level as well as a high level. Because building this kind of movement is going to require some people who take the first tiny step to read something that's a little bit out of their normal range, or going to a demonstration for the first time, as well as people who think in terms of general strikes. And I think that the danger of American capitalists giving us a great society that's going to make us insulated from the rest of the world is close to zero. So I don't worry too much about that at the moment. And I think that, you know, even in the United States, that the labor movement is much more inclined towards an internationalist perspective now than it has probably at any point in its history. Not that there's not room to improve on that. In terms of the working class having created capitalism, I mean, I can't see what your argument is, frankly. I mean, certainly it has helped shape it, and in some cases, in terms of fighting for regulations, it's reinforced the kind of corporate structure, and in terms of, you know, building up pension funds for workers' retirements, you know, it provides one of the main sources of capital to corporations.
I'm talking like Glass-Steagall versus strike for global strike for an 8-hour day. That, like, a global strike for an 8-hour day is a revolutionary movement. Calling for Glass-Steagall is
Well,
So
frankly, I don't think an 8-hour day is a revolutionary movement. You're still going to be a worker for 8 hours. You know?
Right.
It's not a revolutionary movement, it's a great idea.
Well, the
And
revolutionary
it has a nice history.
So
Sorry,
Well,
yeah, if you could finish up. Sorry.
Anyway, then I could comment on other things, but I pass on to the rest of the panel.
Well, no, I mean, feel free, we do have, a few minutes left if you want to.
Go ahead, talk, and if we've got a minute, I'll add something.
Yeah, just a couple points. I mean, about nationalization, a lot of people are very wary of this idea. They think that, we want George Bush to control the auto industry, or George Bush to control the airline industry, or whatever, or Obama. And of course, people are wary of that because of the government that happens to be in power right now. So I think the question we have to raise then is, well, what kind of government should be, administering a nationalized economy? And that's, where the politics and economics obviously can't be separated. I was also not quite sure how to really address your question. I mean, except by saying, in the sense, historical sense, that the capitalist class requires the working class to exist, and the working class needs jobs, so it's going to work for the capitalist class. But at a certain point, the whole contradiction is going to be resolved. I mean, that's the whole sort of, the embryo of the Communist Manifesto, where it talks about, the capitalists creating above all their own gravediggers. But and obviously they reinforce certain institutions, opportunistically, the labor leaders have helped reinforce capitalism for sure, even in the big struggles of the 30s. I mean, the auto workers could have fought for universal health care back then instead of limiting themselves to their own membership. And of course, we would be in a very different situation nowadays if they hadn't had limited demands that ended up, really sort of abandoning, broader layers of the class. And obviously, there's been many contradictions in the history of the U.S. labor movement. But I think on the whole, though, that, the working class isn't protecting capitalism in the way that you put it. I think, the internationalism, it has to be implicit. Capitalism is a global system. Socialism would be a system that begins where capitalism lays off. I don't see any danger at all of a American working class state then becoming a new sort of evil power in the world. I think once it happens here, the rest of the world dominoes of capitalism would fall very quickly. And you'd have to have interaction economically and politically with the rest of the world. I think the question, is labor part of the 99%? Absolutely. The majority of people in this country are labor. In fact, if you look at the actual demographics, it's actually a little broader than the 1%. There is a slightly broader layer that benefits, a little more directly through the system. But I'd say, the Fortune 500 companies, just start with them. They control like 75% of GDP. They employ millions and millions of people. That is less than 1% of the people in this country. So, but I felt that even though 99% might be a bit sort of amorphous in some ways, this idea, it's a lot better than, we're all middle class, which is what we were told for the last couple of decades. This at least put things in sort of an us versus them thing. Of course, how you use that and what you understand by it can vary. But again, just getting back towards the different movements that are going to come together. The anti-globalization movement, the WTO protests in Seattle in '99, cut across by 9/11. Then you've got the anti-war movement emerges. Then you've got the immigrant workers movement, which was a magnificent movement, but very isolated, unfortunately, from the rest of the class at that time, but an important component. A lot of that energy is cut across by Obama's election. Then you've got the Wisconsin movement last spring, super inspiring, then Occupy. But so there's all these different elements that are coming together. And for example, immigrant workers might have their heads down largely right now. And May Day this year is certainly not going to be like May Day in 2006 or 2007, as far as that layer of the working class participating. But they've gone through some important lessons in the last period. And at a certain point, all these kinds of experiences are going to come together, and you will have mass movements that are going to fundamentally transform the politics in this country and the psychology of the people in this country. And that's why we have to be raising these ideas.
Okay. My turn. Okay. I'd like to say what you said was that one of the things I think that's interesting is that a lot of these crises in the awakening of the working class in the United States came largely as a result of the imperialism of the United States being challenged and being defeated somewhat. I mean, we didn't have recessions in the United States until the Mideastern countries nationalized the oil industry, until the oil embargo and the oil crisis, and then it became the foreign policy, not always stated, sometimes not, but to take the oil back by force, which finally happened in 2003. But and that leads to your question. I mean, it's like I don't know that the working class built capitalism, but the working class was given a stake in capitalism. There was a large blue-collar middle class formed, and then they had a lot invested in the status quo, and then they were a little bit loath to challenge it. They became actually, there were people who were blue-collar workers making, say, $50,000 a year, who then bought income properties, bought businesses, bought restaurants, became employers, and bought stock, voted Republican, so Pat Brown, Jerry Brown's father, said that the Democratic Party was a victim of its own success. They got people out of the Depression, built the labor movement, and then so people started making money voting Republican. And that leads to another point, which is kind of a Linskiest, is that people tend to, when you organize, you try to appeal to people's self-interest, and it's a little, so, but I think, so when you talk about imperialism, it might be a little hard to get people to want to give up their own privilege, but fortunately, Occupy is international, so that we could possibly form links with other Occupy movements and become a global international movement. I don't know. That's the only possible solution I can think of right now. But anyway, but what I would like to say to what John said, that I don't disagree with John. I mean, I think that there's a need for the workers to step up. I just don't think that that's Occupy's role necessarily. I mean, there's people who want us to get involved in electoral politics, and that might help. The civil rights movement had a two-pronged strategy. It was it was electoral as well as it was in the streets. But that's, I don't think that's, we don't think that's Occupy's role. Occupy should stay independent, and Occupy does in fact. I mean, the unions were initially the unions were careful not to co-opt us, but they do in fact still try to co-opt us. But and as far as the general strike of May Day, I don't know how much that call is very realistic. I mean, like in the past, the 2006, that was supposed to amount to a general strike. In other words, like a day without the immigrants, so a day without the 99% would amount to a general strike for a day. Or some such thing like that. Essentially, what a strike is to see, see how well you can get along without your workers that you take for granted. See what happens if they don't show up. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, I don't know. See, it's a lot of things are. You can call for them, but unless you do the work and the preparation, like John said, they're not going to happen. So,
So it's 2 minutes to 2:30 here now. If people want to stay for another 5 minutes, I guess we'll take a final round of questions. If the panelists don't mind stick around for another 5 to 10. We had one hand over here first, and we'll take your question next, and then we'll sort of.
Yeah, just really quick. So two questions, I guess. But first, for David and the Occupy, I don't remember your name, Mark. Yeah. So for David and Mark, David just said, the working class basically can be right wing, and that's basically what I heard from you about how the working class can buy and have a stake in capitalism, etc. So that's what I interpret that to mean. So given that, but given the fact that Occupy, premises itself on being just like for popular ideas, for democracy, and also David, you were just talking about, or a lot of your talk was about how it seemed to me that the chief ideological framework that you had was democracy. I mean, what do you make of right-wing popular movements that could be totally, it seems to me that a democratic, just having a framework of democracy doesn't actually get at this problem of right-wing ideologies that could be popular. And so if you could respond to that. And then I have another question for the Trotskyists on the panel, but I'll leave that for maybe later, because it's sort of a different kind of question.
And one more. Yeah.
Coming from old school, if you are not content with the Democrats or the Republicans, may not be in our lifetime, but in their lifetime, if you had to develop a third party, what would it be, and what would your platform be, and what could you promise these kids in the future? If you had a third party, it's just say you got the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Platypus. No, I'm very serious. Because there are a lot of people, even in our generation, and we're 60, who are not content with the Democrats or the Republicans and are looking for a third party. But I don't think it's occupied.
Well, on that note, I would suggest you
What
do
would
take a
you-
look at our editorial statement.
Well, what would your platform be?
Are you asking the panel?
Because there is a possibility that you could do this. What would your platform be, and how would you start? But you've got to.
Starts an international.
Yeah, it's got to, and I don't think violence is the issue. I don't think violence can be a part of this. But I do think this country needs a third party, because people do not like the Democrats and they don't like the Republicans, and let's face it, there's not anybody out there that I would vote for on this platform. But it's this generation that's got to change things. We're almost dead. We can't. We're not gonna do it. But this country needs a third party. And what you have got to get focused on, and I think this is wonderful and good. As a concerned parent, I think it's wonderful and good. I think you need a good leader, for
Okay.
one.
So if the panelists would like to take up those two remarks.
Yeah. I don't think democracy is by itself the only answer, because if we talk about democracy in a formal sense of putting things up for a vote, I mean, in terms just of who's been elected president, it's obvious that majorities can be mobilized for, particularly terrible presidents. But I think democracy is the framework, the pathway within which America is going to get to socialism if it does. Because I think one of the things we have to think about realistically is how we move from where Americans are to some more progressive future, and to take into account why people get drawn into these right-wing movements, and to look at what it is about American culture and American history that we can build on. And one of the things that I think we can build on, and we can give substance to, expand the concept of what democracy ought to involve. For one thing, it ought to involve rights of workers at the workplace, to organize, to have freedom of speech, to have more direct control over investment policies of the company. This would even be within the framework of capitalism, but it expands kind of worker control. Essentially, it's a gradualist point of view. I mean, I think the image of storming the Winter Palace for American transformation is not only unrealistic, but probably undesirable. And so that's one reason why I put this emphasis on not just democracy, but expanding the substance of democracy. But also in terms of parties, I don't think that a third party is going to make much sense unless we can do something about changing the electoral systems. So one place where third parties work in a very limited way in this country right now is like New York State with the Working Families Party. Very limited. It's a separate party, mostly endorses progressive Democrats. It gives people an opportunity to vote for the Working Families Party platform, which is fairly progressive and not explicitly socialist. And it says, I'm voting for you, but I'm voting for you because I believe in these values. And another thing that would make a big difference is simply if you had cumulative voting, so that if you went into the polling place, you voted for the Working Families Party or the Socialist Party, and your second choice was the Democratic Party, and you went through and calculated the votes, it would be like the rounds in a French parliamentary election now. Your Socialist Party vote would be counted, but then it would drop off and it would go to the Democratic Party as your second choice, presumably, something like that. The problem is that the electoral structure, we don't have a parliamentary democracy, we don't have minority votes automatically allotted to Parliament or Congress. we have a structure that makes it very, very, very difficult for any third party to really take off. But the other thing that I think, even within the current context, you keep in mind, is that what we really have, especially with the Democratic Party, is something that's comparable to a European post-election coalition. Where various left-wing parties and social democratic parties and centrist parties will form a coalition after the election, and that's what actually governs. And we have sort of this hodgepodge of a system with the Democratic Party. We have a whole bunch of different components, a nascent Labor Party, and lots of an environmental party, a Green Party, and there is opportunity, especially if we reform the campaign finance laws, for people to run as socialists, as environmentalists.
How about public financing of campaigns, perhaps?
Yeah,
So
sorry,
why-
on this point, if you'd like to make just a short remark, John, and then we'll get to you, Mark, and then we actually do have to close off the panel. We're already 5 minutes off.
All right, very briefly, I would argue that we don't need a third party, we need a first party, and that would be a Labor Party. I would argue that the Democrats and Republicans are so close together now that they can fight over third place, or they can fuse, or whatever they want to do, because the majority in this country are workers, and therefore a massive workers' party, a Labor Party, based on the resources of the unions, based on the numbers of the unions that could actually mobilize people to actually challenge the corporate money. But I think Citibank alone has 5 times more wealth than the whole labor movement. So it's not just about how much money you can put together out there. I really do believe that since the majority of people in this country don't bother even voting, that if you're given an actual, alternative, and it's not necessarily about gradually winning the White House or gradually winning the the Senate or whatever, and then passing laws. I mean, even one person in there, arguing in a disciplined manner for things like jobs, healthcare, education could really start to change things. I personally would argue that a Labor Party should have a socialist program, and that's what I would argue for. But I mean, if it started out as something that refused to take money from any of the corporations, was based only on the membership, both financially and politically. The membership determines the program of the party and so on. It fights for jobs, healthcare, education, etc. I think it could start getting very broad support from people. And just to like to point out that at one point in our U.S. history, the Republicans were also a new party. They were formed in 1854, and they started out with a hodgepodge of different groupings, including abolitionists. And 6 years later, they got their first president and ended up leading a civil war, which was a revolutionary social transformation in this country. And I really think that we're on the verge of a similar kind of a social crisis in this country. We're going to have to decide which property forms, which political forms are going to dominate, and continue ruling humanity as we move forward. So I don't think that we can discount the rapid rise of a new political party based on concrete political situations and concrete needs that people have. So.
Good point, John.
That incidentally was Barry Commoner's argument back in 1980 when he was running as a Citizens Party candidate for president. The analogy with the Republicans.
Yeah.
But I would have to go back to Alinsky, and I would have to say this. I would say that the reason that we at Occupy have a distrust for electoral politics at all. Now, Alinsky described, for example, like if you have an insurgent movement, for example, you're in the opposition. You know what I mean? Then what happens is, then you're against censorship, you're against political repression, you're against, you're against all these things. Then what happens is you succeed, and you become the ruling party, you become the governing party. Then it seems like a very good idea to practice censorship. It seems a very good idea to repress the opposition. Or like Alinsky talked about how he had his people, his people that he organized in the stockyards. He organized in the stockyards. Initially, they were poor. They were very poor. So they drafted a manifesto. All people are brothers, all people are equal, everybody, race, creed, color, doesn't matter, everybody's welcome. Then what happens? They succeeded, they started making money, they moved into the middle class. And as soon as that happened, they started saying, we don't want these people moving into the neighborhood, we don't want those people moving into the neighborhood, we don't want those people moving into the neighborhood. So a lot depends on people's vested interest. It's actually a rare person who will vote against their own vested interest. And that's the world as it is, not as you would like it to be, as Alinsky would say. So, And as far as right-wing democracy, I mean, you could have a democracy that's like I mean, then there are loose definitions of democracy. You could have a democracy where only white property owners, white male property owners can vote, you know, and you could call that a democracy, you know, and I don't know if we would accept that definition of democracy, so.
Great, thanks, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.